I've worked the night shift at the ER for about 5 years now. It's mostly routine, registering patients, coordinating with nurses, and dealing with the occasional late-night rush. Things slow down around 3 a.m. when even the city seems to be asleep. That's when the weirdest things happen. One night I was covering reception mostly alone as the nurses moved in and out of the station. It was a slow shift. Only a couple of patients waiting, an elderly woman with a sprained wrist, a guy who got into a bar fight, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 3:15 a.m., I looked up from my monitor and saw her. A woman sitting in the waiting area, her back hunched, her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a pale blue hospital gown, one of ours, but I didn't remember seeing her come in. I had been talking to a patient, a drunk guy who was slurring his words and needed help filling out his paperwork, so maybe I had missed her arrival. But when I checked the log, she wasn't on it. No one had called her name. She was just there. She looked sick. Her skin was sallow, almost gray, and she had deep shadows under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. Her dark hair hung limply around her face, but what struck me most was how still she was. She didn't fidget, didn't check her phone. She just sat, staring at the floor. I glanced over at the triage nurse, Karen, who had been flipping through a chart. "Hey, did you check in that woman?" I asked. Karen looked up, confused. "Who?" I turned back to the waiting area, ready to point her out, but the seat was empty. My stomach dropped. She couldn't have just walked out, not without me hearing the door or seeing movement. The security doors only opened when buzzed from the desk, and I hadn't hit the button. I shook it off. Maybe I'd been staring at the screen too long. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was late after all. About an hour later I went to grab a coffee from the vending machine near the entrance. As I passed by the waiting area, I felt it again, that weird sense of stillness. And there she was, same seat, same pale blue gown, staring at the floor. This time I didn't look away. "Ma'am," I called, no reaction. I stepped closer. "Are you waiting for someone?" She lifted her head, just slightly. That's when I noticed something strange. She was sitting so still it felt unnatural, like someone holding their breath on purpose. I backed away and walked briskly to the nurse's station. Karen was still there, this time logging vitals into the system. "There's a woman in the waiting room," I said, keeping my voice low. "She's not checked in, but she's wearing a hospital gown. I think she might have wandered down from a room." Karen frowned. "Where?" I turned and pointed. "Empty." Now I felt like I was losing it. Karen gave me a tired look. "You need a break." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just overtired, seeing shadows where there weren't any. I took my coffee and went back to the desk, forcing myself to focus on paperwork. Around 5 a.m., after coming back from a quick bathroom break, I checked the security footage, just to be sure. I pulled up the waiting room feed from earlier. The timestamp showed 3:15 a.m. The camera angle faced the chairs. I pressed play. The waiting room was empty. My pulse sped up. I scrubbed through the footage, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The entire time from when I had first seen her to when I got up to get coffee, the waiting room had been empty. But just as I was about to turn off the feed, I saw something. The chair she had been sitting in moved. Not much, just a slight shift, like someone had just stood up. The footage flickered, and for a brief second, it looked like something was beginning to take shape near the chair. I panicked and closed the program before I could see any more. A chill ran down my spine as I watched. If I saw something undeniable, something I couldn't explain, I'd never be able to unsee it. The next morning, I told one of the older nurses about what happened. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she nodded and said, "A woman died in the ER last year around 3 a.m. She was wearing a blue gown when they brought her in." Since that night, I avoid thinking about it too much. I tell myself it's easier not to know that some things are better left unexplored. But deep down, I know better. Maybe that's why I never went back to rewatch the footage. I've worked as a night shift nurse for 6 years. It's not an easy job. Long hours, understaffed nights, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones. Hospitals at night aren't like what people think. There's no constant rush, no bustling energy, just dimly lit hallways, the rhythmic beeping of machines, and the occasional distant sound of a patient groaning in their sleep. It's quiet. Too quiet. You learn things working the night shift. The way some rooms seem colder than others, even when the temperature settings are the same. The way seasoned nurses don't like talking about certain places in the hospital, as if acknowledging something might make it worse. You start to notice patterns, how some nights are just another shift, quiet and uneventful, while others carry a weight you can't quite explain, like everyone is waiting for something to happen. Even understanding this, what happened next, was something I still can't explain. The night had been quiet, the kind where the minutes drag, and you almost forget you're in a place where life and death cross paths constantly. I had just finished checking vitals on a patient down the hall when the call came in. Patient in room 312 had gone into cardiac arrest. My colleague Sarah and I rushed in to assist the code team. It was a long attempt, nearly 45 minutes of compressions, adrenaline shots, the defibrillator, but nothing worked. The patient was gone. The doctor called it at 4:14 a.m., time of death recorded. We cleaned the body, tagged the toe, and placed a sheet over his face, standard procedure. The body transport team was on their way to take him down to the morgue, but they were backed up, so we were stuck waiting. Sarah and I stayed for a moment after, looking at each other as the weight of the past 45 minutes sank in. Neither of us spoke right away. You never really get used to it, even when you think you have. "That sucked," Sarah finally muttered, rubbing her eyes. 45 minutes, we really tried. "Yeah," I sighed. "Still doesn't feel real." She shook her head. "Nope." That's when we heard it. Beep. It was faint, but unmistakable. We both turned toward the room. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. I nodded slowly. "Yeah." Another beep. We exchanged uneasy looks before stepping back inside. The heart monitor was still attached to the patient. Beep. My stomach dropped. That was impossible. I stared at the screen. The monitor showed an erratic heartbeat, weak but present. "No way," Sarah whispered. That has to be a glitch, right?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." We lifted the sheet. The patient's face was pale, his eyes slightly open but unfocused. His body was stiff, cold, dead, and yet the monitor kept beeping. I pressed my fingers to his wrist, his neck. No pulse. I grabbed my stethoscope, pressed it against his chest. Silence. No heartbeat. "The hell is going on?" Sarah's voice wavered. I didn't have an answer, but something was wrong. I yanked off the electrodes. The screen should have flatlined immediately. It didn't. Instead, the beeping continued, erratic, scattered, a weak, flickering heartbeat that didn't belong to the body in front of me. Sarah muttered a curse and yanked the plug from the wall. The screen went black. For a second, the room was silent. Then a sound broke the stillness, the kind you hear right before someone dies. We both froze. My heart was hammering in my chest. Sarah took a step back. "No, no. The patient's mouth was slightly open, but no air came out. His chest didn't move. It was just a sound, a hollow deathbed breath that had no right existing in a body that no longer functioned. We stood there, paralyzed, until the transport team arrived. We didn't tell them what happened. What were we supposed to say, that a dead man took one last breath for no reason? They took him to the morgue. Sarah and I finished our shift in silence. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mechanical error, a delay in the system. But that didn't explain the sound, the way the breath felt, the way my stomach churned just thinking about it. Until this day, I try to convince myself there was a rational reason for what happened. Wires crossing, delayed readings, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but the part of me that stood in that room knows the dead don't breathe. I've always been drawn to Las Vegas, the neon glow, the relentless energy, the promise of big opportunities. This trip, however, wasn't for pleasure. I was here on business. With a tight budget and little choice, I booked a cheap Airbnb on the outskirts, a place that promised a quick, affordable stay so I could focus on work. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that awaited me that night. The house appeared to be an economical, if unremarkable, shelter from the harsh desert heat. But the moment I crossed its threshold, an inexplicable sense of foreboding washed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a place with secrets too dark to comprehend. After a long drive and a taxing day of work, I was ready to rest. Instead of immediately unpacking, I decided to allow myself a brief reprieve, a 10-minute nap to clear my head. I told myself it was just exhaustion and that a short rest would help me settle in. I drifted into a light sleep, convinced that when I woke any uneasy feelings would simply be a residue of travel fatigue. But as I awoke, I couldn't shake a lingering uncertainty, an odd nagging sensation that perhaps even my nap had been touched by something unexplainable. I chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. Little did I know that the true horror was yet to come. As midnight approached, the atmosphere changed. The gentle glow of the lamp waned, replaced by an eerie half-light that made every shadow seem alive. I began to notice sounds, subtle creaks, distant whispers, that I couldn't explain. The house, once a safe haven, now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were watching me. The line between reality and nightmare was beginning to blur. Then I heard it, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the house. The basement door, usually locked tight, creaked open as if beckoning me. A deep, almost inhuman whisper slithered out from the darkness, reciting words in a language I couldn't understand. I froze. My mind screamed to run, but a twisted curiosity held me in place. I felt compelled to know what lay beneath. With each hesitant step, the air grew colder, and the voices, now more insistent, seemed to echo off the walls. I knew then that this was no ordinary house. It was a vessel for something dark and ancient. Down in that oppressive darkness, I discovered signs of a forgotten horror. Symbols, cryptic, jagged, marred the concrete floor and walls. The scent of decay and something bitter, like burnt incense mixed with old regret, overwhelmed me. In that moment I realized that this basement held the remnants of a terrible secret, a curse born of agony and betrayal. I almost couldn't breathe as I watched a ghostly figure flicker before my eyes, a vision of sorrow and eternal torment. The journal I later found on a rickety table would tell me the truth. Decades ago, a tragic love ended in betrayal and murder, and in her final moments, she cursed the house. That curse, I now knew, had been waiting for me. As I fled back to the upper floors, the house seemed to come alive. The boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. Every creak and whisper was a reminder of the curse now unleashed. I could feel the malevolent force tightening its grip on the very structure, determined to keep me trapped within its labyrinth of terror. I ran through hallways that seemed to shift and change, as if the house itself was rearranging its rooms to trap me. The whispers grew into anguished cries, and every step I took was matched by the pounding of my heart. I knew I had to escape, but every exit was blocked by the relentless force of that ancient curse. In a final, desperate bid for survival, I pushed through the confusion. I tried every door, every window, but the house twisted around me like a living maze. With each failed attempt, the ghostly laughter and mournful wails of unseen souls drove me to the brink of madness. I felt the curse's presence all around me, a suffocating weight that whispered, "You belong to us." For a moment I was paralyzed by terror, truly convinced that I would never escape this prison of shadows. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet I felt rooted in place, caught in the grip of something that had transcended time. At long last, the first light of dawn crept in, revealing the true extent of the horror I'd endured. I emerged from that cursed dwelling broken and trembling, a soul forever scarred by a night that defied explanation. That cheap Airbnb was no longer just a temporary stop for work. It had become a haunted vessel, stained by ancient sorrow and a malevolent curse. Even as the sun rose, the dread remained. The whispers, the shifting shadows, they persisted, a chilling reminder that some nightmares never truly fade. I awoke in a haze, not fully knowing where I was. Was it the aftermath of a nightmare, or had I truly escaped the clutches of that cursed house? The line between reality and a dream blurred in my mind, leaving me haunted by uncertainty. I remember vivid fragments, the whispering walls, the spectral figure, the relentless curse. Yet, as I slowly came to, I wasn't sure if it was all real or merely a terrible hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. I share my story not to seek pity but to warn you. In this modern age of digital bookings and fleeting escapes, Even the most unremarkable Airbnb can hide a darkness beyond comprehension. Las Vegas, with its neon allure and promise of opportunity, can be a place where ancient curses and unspeakable terrors lie hidden behind unsuspecting doors. So, the next time you book an Airbnb, especially in a city as unpredictable as Las Vegas, ask yourself, could this cheap retreat be a gateway to something sinister? Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying nightmares are only a booking away. I remember it all too clearly. My wife and I had dreamed of a romantic escape, a honeymoon in Bangkok, promised as an authentic local retreat, booked through an Airbnb boasting both modern comforts and a touch of old-world charm. Yet from the moment we arrived, a deep sense of unease crept in. I stepped off the taxi into a muggy Bangkok night, the city alive with neon signs and the constant hum of street vendors. But as I turned down a narrow, unassuming alley to reach our temporary home, the vibrant pulse of Bangkok faded into a heavy silence. The building was ancient, its faded facade and overgrown courtyard suggesting that secrets lingered long after time had passed. Inside the apartment was an odd blend of modern amenities and relics from a bygone era. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that I first encountered Lek, a domestic helper assigned to keep the kitchen pristine and the rooms in order. At first glance, Lek was the epitome of efficient service. Her movements were measured, her uniform immaculate, an anachronism in a modern setting. Yet something about her unsettled me. There was a distant, sorrowful quality in her eyes, as though they held memories of a life far removed from the present. Every time I caught a glimpse of her in a reflective surface, a window or a polished countertop, her figure blurred at the edges, wavering between worlds. I dismissed my growing discomfort as mere nerves in an unfamiliar place, but as the days passed, that nagging feeling deepened. I began to wonder if there was more to Lek than met the eye. One sleepless night, when the humid darkness pressed against the thin apartment walls, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. At first I assumed it was a stray notification. Then came a series of cryptic texts from an unknown number, messages that chilled me to the bone. In service she labors beyond the veil of time. Remember 1973. Her duty never ended, she lingers still. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Attached to the first message was an old sepia-toned photo. A woman in the same uniform as Lek, her face etched with grief and a haunting emptiness. The date stamped in the corner read 1973. My heart pounded as I realized that the kindly helper I'd observed might be a remnant of a past long forgotten, a ghost bound by duty. In the nights that followed, more messages arrived, snippets of a tragic tale hinting at an accident, betrayal, and a life extinguished in this very building. Each notification deepened the chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the apartment. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Lek appear in impossible places, a fleeting silhouette in the doorway of the kitchen, or reflected in a dark window, her eyes no longer warm but glowing with a spectral light. Unable to tolerate the mounting terror any longer, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. One fateful midnight, driven by desperation for answers, I followed the soft, measured footsteps echoing through the silent corridors. In the dim glow of the kitchen, I finally saw her, Lek standing as if she had always belonged there. For a long, breathless moment, I simply stared. Then, as if compelled by forces beyond my control, I heard her speak, a voice layered with the sorrow of ages past.
I was once entrusted with care in this home. In my final hours I was forsaken, my life taken without justice, my duty unfulfilled. I have lingered here, bound by a promise I could never break.
Those words shattered every notion of normalcy. In that heart-stopping moment I understood Lek was not alive. She was the ghost of a woman trapped in eternal servitude, condemned to roam these halls by a tragedy that no one dared remember. The revelation was too much to bear. Panic surged through me as the spectral figure of Lek slowly dissolved into the shadows. I gathered what little courage I possessed and without a backward glance fled that oppressive apartment into the restless Bangkok night. Every step away felt like an escape from a past that clung desperately to the present, a past that, even now, whispers its sorrow in every silent corner of my mind. For weeks my wife and I tried to settle into our new life, convinced that we had finally left that cursed building behind. One crisp evening, we arrived at our new house, a modest home that we hoped would be a fresh start. Exhausted yet relieved, we unlocked the door and stepped into our living room, trying to shake off the lingering memories of our ordeal. No sooner had we begun to relax than my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting a routine notification. Instead, my blood ran cold as I read the message.
I am here always in service.
I froze, my heart hammered in my chest. The message was simple, yet its implications were impossible to ignore. It was as if Lek, the spectral helper we had left behind, had followed us. Her duty unending, her presence now an inescapable part of our lives. I looked at my wife, whose eyes mirrored my terror. In that moment, I knew that our escape had been an illusion. The past had reached out to claim us, and Lek's ghost would now walk with us forever. I share this story not as a boast or a thrill-seeking confession, but as a dire warning. Sometimes the darkest horrors follow you home, and if you ever find yourself served by a kind face with sorrowful eyes, remember my tale, because that presence might never leave you, whispering its eternal promise, I am here always in service. I needed a break. Weeks of endless work at the office had drained me, and I was desperate to escape the monotony. That's why I booked the mansion, a quiet weekend away from the city in a grand old estate I found on Airbnb. The photos promised vintage charm, secluded luxury, and a peaceful retreat from the chaos of modern life. The mansion stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. As I stepped out of my car, a shiver ran down my spine. The door was slightly ajar, a low creak escaping its hinges as I pushed it open. The mansion's front door creaked shut behind me, the sound echoing through the silent house. The entry hall was vast and imposing, with a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor. A pale light flickered on, revealing a room frozen in time. I continued my exploration, each room more unsettling than the last. The dining room was equally eerie, set for a feast that would never come. A half-finished game of chess sat on a table in the library. It felt as though the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. I found myself drawn back to the living room, compelled by the unsettling gaze of the man in the portrait. As I knelt down to arrange the logs, I felt a cold draft, like a phantom breath on the back of my neck. The man in the portrait seemed to stare down at me, a hint of amusement or perhaps malice in his eyes. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, I felt a surge of fear, cold and sharp, grip my heart. Drawn by an unspoken invitation, I ventured deeper into the mansion's shadowy heart. I stumbled upon the library quite by accident, its entrance concealed behind a tapestry. The library was a sight to behold, a testament to a bygone era of scholarly pursuits. The faint glow of the setting sun filtered through the grime-coated glass, casting long, dancing shadows across the dusty floor. As I moved deeper into the library, my foot brushed against something solid hidden beneath a faded Persian rug. Curiosity piqued, I bent down and carefully lifted the edge of the rug, revealing a small iron ring set into the floorboards. With bated breath, I grasped the handle and pulled. The floorboards groaned in protest as a section of the bookshelf swung inwards, revealing a narrow, dark passageway beyond. The air within the hidden room was heavy with the scent of decay and the faint, cloying aroma of jasmine. A single flickering gas lamp illuminated a small, dusty table upon which lay a leather-bound diary. The diary belonged to a man named Richard, his elegant script a stark contrast to the unsettling content contained within its pages. Richard's descriptions mirrored my own experiences, confirming the chilling realization that I was not alone in this haunted mansion. As I delved deeper into Richard's diary, each page I turned seemed to amplify the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. Richard's words painted a vivid picture of his descent into madness. According to Richard's increasingly disjointed entries, the midnight guest appeared at the stroke of 12. Richard believed the tapping was the midnight guest's way of announcing its arrival, a prelude to a terrifying encounter. My hands trembled as I reached the final entry in Richard's diary. The entry was dated exactly 50 years to the day before my arrival. The mansion was not just haunted, it was a predator, luring unsuspecting victims into its web of despair. I had to get out of there, had to escape the mansion's clutches before it claimed me as its own. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white as I fought against the wave of nausea. And then, I heard it. A soft rhythmic tapping, echoing faintly from somewhere deep within the mansion's bowels. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, each tap like a hammer blow against my sanity. I had to get out of there, had to find a way to escape the mansion's clutches. Panic surged through me, hot and desperate. I fumbled blindly for the hidden door, my hands scraping against rough-hewn stone. My fingers finally found the iron ring cold and slick against my clammy skin. I pulled with all my might, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it was being held shut by an unseen force, a malevolent entity that relished my desperation. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the hidden room into an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound that had preceded it. I held my breath, listening intently, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then, I saw it. A faint glow, emanating from the space beyond the hidden door, slowly illuminated a figure standing silently in the doorway. The figure was tall and skeletal, its form shrouded in a tattered black cloak that seemed to absorb the meager light. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could sense its gaze fixed upon me, cold and calculating like a predator sizing up its prey. I bolted as the skeletal figure advanced, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the cold stone floor. My heart thundered in my ears as I tore away from the hidden passage, every instinct screaming to escape. The mansion seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, its corridors twisting into a labyrinth of shifting darkness. I followed a narrow, winding stairwell I'd never noticed before, a desperate path illuminated only by the erratic flicker of a dying chandelier. Every step was a battle against the suffocating fear that the mansion was determined to keep me captive. The tapping had resumed somewhere behind me, a relentless metronome urging my flight, and I could hear a low, ragged whisper echoing through the halls. "You can't leave." But I dared not slow down. At last, I reached a heavy door that creaked open to a narrow, moonlit passage. With trembling hands I pushed through, finding myself on the overgrown grounds of the estate. The chill night air was a brutal contrast to the mansion's oppressive heat, and I ran blindly across the lawn as if the darkness itself were trying to reclaim me. Behind me the mansion loomed, its once inviting facade now a sinister maw of shadows. I didn't dare look back as I scrambled down the long, winding driveway, the rhythmic tapping fading into the distance with each desperate step. When I finally burst through the wrought iron gate, I paused, shivering in the early whispers of dawn. The terror of the night clung to me like a curse, yet I had escaped the mansion's clutches, its dark promise unfulfilled. Still, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, a chill lingered in my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden in the gloom of that cursed estate, the tapping was only waiting for the next unwary soul to cross its threshold.
There are certain stories you don't bring up at family gatherings, Not because they're embarrassing or painful, but because they just don't feel right to talk about. This is one of them. I was 8 the last time I visited my grandparents' house. I never went back after that. My grandparents lived in a quiet town, the kind where time felt slower. They had been there for as long as I could remember, in a modest house at the edge of a long dirt road. My dad dropped me off one afternoon, stayed for lunch, then left. After that, I spent most of the afternoon outside, playing with a stray cat that had been hanging around their yard. My grandfather sat on the porch, watching me in silence, while my grandmother stayed inside, probably cleaning or baking like she always did. At some point, she called me in for dinner. I don't remember exactly what we ate, but it was something homemade, probably soup or stew, something warm. We talked a little, nothing serious. Just the usual questions. How was school? Was I making friends? Was I listening to my parents? After dinner, we sat in the living room while they watched TV. I wasn't paying much attention to the show, just flipping through an old deck of cards on the coffee table, passing the time. It was a normal day. When it became late, my grandmother told me it was time to sleep. I wasn't really tired, but I didn't argue. I went to the extra room where I always stayed. Then I climbed into bed. Everything felt normal. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep. The wind was strong outside, making the curtains flutter. It was hot, so I preferred leaving the window opened. Then I heard something else, a faint scraping sound. At first it blended into the wind, but then it came again. I sat up slightly, listening. The sound moved from one side of the roof to the other. I wanted to believe it was just the wind pushing something across the shingles, but the pauses felt deliberate. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden sharp knock. I froze. I heard my grandparents moving. A door swung open. My grandfather's boots hit the floor. My grandmother whispered something I couldn't understand. Then, footsteps coming toward my room. The door opened, and my grandmother rushed in first, her face pale. My grandfather followed with a riffle in his hands. "Under the bed," she whispered. I obeyed without question, sliding off the mattress and pressing myself against the wooden floor. From my hiding place, I saw my grandfather move to the window. He lifted the curtain an inch, staring out. His body was rigid, unmoving. Then, from above, another faint scraping sound. My grandmother clutched the rosary around her neck, whispering under her breath. We stayed like that for around half an hour, waiting, listening. Eventually, my grandfather exhaled, lowering the rifle. Without saying anything, my grandmother reached down and touched my shoulder. "Come," she whispered. They took me to their room. I slept between them that night. None of us spoke. None of us slept much either. I thought maybe they wouldn't mention it in the morning, but when I came into the kitchen, they were already sitting at the table, staring at their coffee. My grandmother had a Bible open in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. My grandfather stared out the window, his fingers tapping against the table, slow and restless. I sat down, waiting for them to say something. My grandfather exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "They haven't come in a long time." I hesitated. "Who?" My grandmother's eyes flickered to the window before she answered. "The witches." She barely whispered it, like the word itself could bring them back. She looked at me then, her face tight. "They know when there are children in the house." A chill ran through me. Before I could say anything else, I heard a car pull up outside. I frowned. My dad wasn't supposed to come until the end of the week. I looked at my grandparents, but neither of them seemed surprised. My grandfather stood up and grabbed my bag. My grandmother placed her hand on my shoulder. No one said it, but I understood. My parents didn't ask many questions. Maybe they expected my grandparents to be their usual selves, smiling, talking about how much fun I was having. Instead, they were quiet. My grandfather barely spoke as he carried my bag to the car. My grandmother hugged me tight, her grip lingering longer than usual. Before we left, she looked at my dad. "Let's not bring him here again." My dad nodded. I didn't argue. That night, back home in my own bed, I lay awake for a long time listening. I thought about the noises, the scraping, the pauses between movements, the way it had stopped, right before the laugh. But eventually, sleep came, and over time, I started to forget, not all at once, but little by little, the memory faded, like a bad dream. But I never went back.
I've been a nanny for a few years now, and if you think it's just babysitting, you'd be surprised. A good nanny doesn't just watch kids. We anticipate their moods, handle tantrums, prep meals, and keep the house running smoothly. Sometimes we become a child's entire world when their parents are too busy. It's exhausting, sure, but rewarding. My days start early, usually around 7 a.m. I prepare breakfast, balancing something nutritious with something they'd actually eat. Kids can be picky, and getting a 4-year-old to eat fruit instead of just cereal is a battle of psychology. Then comes the morning routine. Brushing teeth, picking out outfits, and getting them ready for the day. Once the kid is at preschool, I have a few hours for light housework or personal time before picking them up. Afternoons are filled with playtime, lunch, and quiet activities. Some days I take them to the park or arranged play dates. Once dinner and the bedtime routine are finished by 8 p.m., my workday is usually done. The schedule is demanding but manageable, with structured breaks when the kids are at school or napping. I loved it, even on the hard days. But I'd left my last job under tense circumstances. The child I cared for, Max, had become incredibly attached to me, more than his own parents, and that was a problem. His mother resented how much he clung to me, and no matter how much I tried to redirect his affections, she saw me as a threat. It escalated until one day she told me I was no longer needed. It broke my heart, but I knew I had to move on. That's why I was excited when I landed a live-in position for a single mom and her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie. The pay was great, the hours were stable, and the house was a dream. One of those modern homes with high ceilings and too many doors. Most importantly, Claire, the mother, seemed easygoing and genuinely kind. She wasn't just hiring help, she wanted someone who could bond with Sophie. The first day was great. Sophie was sweet, Claire was welcoming, and everything felt comfortable. Claire seemed relaxed, chatting with me casually about the job, and for the most part, everything felt natural. But when she brought up one particular rule, something in her tone shifted. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Don't open the door at the end of the hall," she said, her voice still light but lacking the same ease as before. "It just stays shut, okay?" Every house has its quirks. Maybe it was just a storage room, or maybe she didn't want Sophie playing in there. It seemed like a harmless enough request. I was too grateful for the job to question it or invade her privacy. Life with Sophie was enjoyable. She was energetic, talkative, and eager to do things herself. Mornings were spent getting her ready for preschool, and afternoons were a mix of activities. She was curious and always on the move, helping with small tasks. Mealtimes could be a challenge, and bedtime often involved negotiating for one more story, but eventually she'd settle in. Overall, the job was predictable and pleasant. Sophie was an easy kid, bright, chatty, and at that age where they tell you the wildest things with full confidence. One night, everything started changing. As I tucked Sophie in, she looked at me seriously and whispered, "Can I tell you a secret?" I nodded, expecting something innocent. But then she leaned in closer and said, "There's a girl in there. She doesn't like being alone." She pointed toward the hallway. I paused, smoothing her blanket. To who, sweetie? The girl in the locked room. I forced a smile. You mean your mommy? Sophie shook her head. No, the other girl. A shiver crawled down my spine. It's funny how one small thing can change everything. From that night on, I became aware of the door in a way I hadn't before. I started noticing how Sophie never played near it, how she kept a careful distance when she passed it in the hallway. A few days later, as I was tying her shoes, she mumbled, "She doesn't like when the door is locked." I kept my voice light. Who doesn't like it? She frowned like I was being dense. The girl locked in the room, she gets lonely. The hair on my arms prickled. I laughed it off, but something about the way Sophie said it, so matter-of-fact, stayed with me. I told myself it was just a child's imagination. But as the days went on, Sophie kept mentioning the girl. Once, as I tucked her in, she whispered, "She's watching." I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. Another night she reached for my hand and said, "She wants you to say goodnight to her." I stared at the closed door down the hall. My chest felt tight. I forced a chuckle. "Well, good night." Sophie beamed and snuggled into her blankets. Now she's happy. My blood ran cold. We were completely alone. By week 3, I was jumpy. I found myself avoiding looking at the door entirely. The worst part? Nothing happening. There were no creaks, no flickering lights, no eerie shadows. Just an ordinary door that suddenly felt impossibly, terrifyingly. Then one night I was closing Sophie's door when I heard her whisper, "She's in there right now." I gripped the doorknob. My voice was barely steady. "Sophie, who is she?" She blinked at me like I was the child. The girl in the locked room. Mommy locked her. I nearly quit that night. The next morning, I moved through my routine like a ghost, fixing Sophie's breakfast, dropping her off at preschool, tidying the house. But my mind was elsewhere. The locked door. By midday, my curiosity got the better of me. Claire wasn't home, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in front of the door. I placed my hand on the knob, hesitated, and twisted. Locked. I kneeled down and peered through the small gap beneath the door. Darkness. Something about that emptiness sent a wave of unease through me. I reached up again, hand gripping the knob, this time willing myself to turn harder. But I stopped. I didn't want to know. I pulled my hand away, stood up, and walked back down the hall, telling myself it didn't matter. That night, before going to bed, I stood in front of the door, arms crossed, trying to rationalize everything. It was just a door. Just a locked room, nothing more. I told myself Sophie had an active imagination, that I had let my own fears get the best of me. I even whispered a quiet goodbye to the ridiculous fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks before finally heading to bed. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, heart hammering. It rattled again, harder this time, as if something was testing it from the other side. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't check to see if anything was behind me. I went to my room, grabbed my things, and left. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally took control, and I let it. I needed to be anywhere but there. I packed my things and left. The next morning I called Claire, keeping my voice steady as I explained I had a family emergency and wouldn't be able to come back. She didn't ask questions. She just sighed and said she understood. I never found out what was behind that door, and I never wanted to know.
Hey there, I'm Alex. Over the years, I've been on my fair share of Tinder dates, some awkward, some fun, but nothing ever prepared me for the night I'm about to share with you. A night that started with a casual match and ended with an experience I still can't quite explain. It began on an ordinary evening. I was swiping through Tinder when I came across Clara's profile. There was something about her, a mix of mystery and vulnerability that instantly caught my attention. Our conversation started light, favorite movies, quirky hobbies, and a mutual love for anything vintage. It wasn't long before we planned to meet for a proper date. We met at a quaint little coffee shop downtown. Over lattes and shared pastries, our conversation flowed effortlessly. Clara was witty, warm, and surprisingly candid. Amid the laughter and easy banter, I noticed subtle hints that she was holding back a worry she hadn't yet voiced. But I never guessed how significant that concern would become. After our date, as we walked along the street toward my car, Clara suddenly paused. With a tremor in her voice, she admitted, "Alex, I just moved into a new apartment. I'm really scared to sleep there alone tonight. It just feels off." There was a raw honesty in her eyes, a fear that went beyond the usual nerves of a first date. Without hesitation, I offered, "Why don't I come with you? I'll help keep the night less lonely." She nodded gratefully, and that was all it took to set the next part of our evening in motion. I drove her to her new apartment, which was situated in a quiet part of town. The roads were empty, and the sparse glow of streetlights made the night feel even more surreal. Every turn of the road heightened my awareness. Each shadow seemed to stretch just a bit too long, and every rustle of the wind hinted at secrets lurking in the dark. When we arrived, the building looked like something out of a forgotten ghost story. Its exterior was weathered, and the few lights inside flickered uncertainly. Clara unlocked the door and led me into a sparse, dimly lit foyer. There was an odd chill in the air, a feeling that this place had its own history, one that might not be entirely friendly. Inside, Clara tried to settle her nerves. We moved to the living room, and after a few minutes of tentative conversation, we agreed on a simple plan. Keep each other company for the night. Nothing more, just two souls seeking comfort in an unsettling environment. I remember the quiet intensity in the room, the soft hum of the old clock, and the way her eyes occasionally darted toward the shadows in the corners. Somewhere in the middle of the night, when the world outside had settled into silence, I woke up thirsty and decided to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I made my way through the dark hallway, I became aware of a soft, shuffling sound behind me. I paused, straining to listen. The sound grew slightly louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I whispered, "Clara?" but received no answer. Instead, a dark, shifting silhouette appeared at the edge of my vision, moving silently in the opposite direction. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the living room. That's when I noticed something alarming. Clara's jacket lay draped over an armchair, yet there was no sign of her anywhere. I searched the small apartment frantically, the kitchen, the narrow hallways, even peering out the window onto the dim courtyard. It was as if she'd simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the unsettling echo of my own footsteps. I grabbed my phone and searched for Clara's number. It wasn't there. Maybe I saved it wrong. I checked Tinder instead, scrolling frantically. No messages, no match, no Clara. My stomach twisted. She was just here. Her jacket still lay draped over the chair. She had to be real. Panic set in. Was it a trick of the mind, or had I really seen something inexplicable? The dread that had been simmering inside me finally erupted. I couldn't stay there another moment. I grabbed my keys, my phone still buzzing with unanswered notifications, and bolted out of that eerie place into the cold night. Every minute on that drive away felt like an eternity as I desperately tried to outrun the inexplicable terror of that night. I eventually managed to drive to a quiet spot, my heart still hammering in my chest as I tried to piece together what had happened. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting shadow, or the mystery of Clara's sudden disappearance. Friends insisted it was just my overactive imagination fueled by nerves and the late hour. But deep down, I know what I saw. I began to wonder, had I been chosen by some inexplicable force that night? Or had I unwittingly stepped into a scenario where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural blurred? I still ask myself, did Clara really exist as I knew her, or was she merely a vessel for something else? A lingering spirit in that haunted new apartment? Whatever the truth, that night changed my perspective forever. I learned to trust my instincts, to heed the quiet warnings when something feels off, even if it seems like nothing more than nerves at first. Maybe some nights, the unseen isn't just a product of our imagination, but a glimpse into a hidden world that we're not meant to understand. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever experienced a night that left you questioning reality, share your thoughts below. Sometimes the things we fear in the dark are not just figments of our imagination. They might be real. Stay safe out there and remember to trust that gut feeling.
Hi, I'm Sophia. Today I want to share something deeply personal, an experience that changed how I view trust and safety in dating. This isn't an easy story to tell, but I believe it's important. What I'm about to share includes distressing details, so please take care if you're sensitive to this topic. Viewer discretion is advised. My story starts like many modern dating tales. I met a guy on Tinder, and our first couple of dates were exactly what you'd hope for: casual coffee meetups and pleasant walks in the park. He seemed friendly, attractive, and we really clicked. I felt comfortable, even excited as we got to know each other. By the time our third date came around, I was already feeling a level of trust that many of you might relate to. But sometimes things that feel safe on the surface can hide a dangerous side. On that third date, he invited me over to his apartment for a glass of wine. Everything appeared normal at first. We laughed, talked, and shared stories. But then I started to feel off. An unsettling sensation crept over me that I couldn't ignore. I had been through something similar before. I was once roofied. When the wine began to affect me, I immediately recognized the symptoms. In that moment, my mind went into overdrive. I knew I had to act, and fast. Despite the growing panic inside me, I forced myself to remain calm. I didn't want to alert him to my alarm, so I smiled and said, "I'm just going to use the restroom," keeping my voice light even though every second felt like an eternity. Inside that small bathroom, I locked the door. I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and immediately dialed 911. In a shaky whisper, I told the operator that I felt drugged and that I was trapped inside. My heart was racing. I knew this could be a matter of life or death before I knew it. The drugs took hold, and I lost consciousness. In that darkness, I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I clung to the hope that help was on the way. When I woke up, I wasn't in that terrifying apartment anymore. I was surrounded by police officers. I was still heavily drugged, slipping in and out of consciousness, but their presence was my first real sign of safety. I remember the officers covering my head with a bag. At the time, in my haze, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if it really happened. Later, when I was taken to the police station and asked to recount every detail, they confirmed it was real. They explained that they had placed the bag over my head to shield me from something absolutely horrifying in the living room, a scene so traumatic they couldn't let me see it. They said that what lay in that living room was far too disturbing for me to witness after what I had just endured. I shudder to think of what I might have seen. That simple act of covering my eyes may have spared me even deeper trauma. This experience changed everything for me. It's a reminder that even when things seem to be going well, hidden dangers can lurk beneath the surface. The man I trusted ended up in jail, but the emotional scars and lingering questions remain with me every day. I'm sharing my story not just as a catharsis for myself, but as a warning to others. Whether it's your first date or your third, always let someone you trust know your plans. A quick call or text can be a lifeline if things take a turn for the worse. If you ever feel uneasy or notice red flags, even when you think you're comfortable, please listen to that inner voice. It might just save your life.
Hi, I'm Samantha. I used to think Tinder was just about awkward first dates and unexpected chemistry. That was until I matched with Evan, a man whose mystery ran deeper than any profile I'd seen before. What began as an intriguing connection soon spiraled into a nightmare that blurred the lines between life and death. It started on a rainy Tuesday. I was idly swiping when Evan's profile stopped me in my tracks. His picture was strikingly old-fashioned, a black and white image that seemed to come from another era. His bio was minimalist, reading only, lost in time searching for meaning. His mysterious aura compelled me to swipe right, and to my surprise, we matched immediately. We agreed to meet at a local coffee shop. Evan was even more enigmatic in person. He spoke softly, with a hint of melancholy in his eyes, and his mannerisms were almost archaic. Over lattes and gentle conversation, I found myself drawn to his wistful stories. He casually mentioned that his photos were in black and white because they reminded him of a time when life was simpler. I brushed it off as quirky charm, until the unsettling details began to surface. After our date, something changed. As I walked home, my phone buzzed with new messages from Evan. They weren't the light, playful texts of before. Instead, they were cryptic and tinged with sorrow. "You've seen what should not be seen," one read. The timestamps were strange, dating back decades rather than hours. Each message sent a chill down my spine. I tried replying, but my words fell into a void of silence. Haunted and desperate for answers, I turned to the internet. I soon uncovered a series of old newspaper clippings about a young man named Evan who had vanished in the 1970s under mysterious circumstances. The similarities were undeniable. The same wistful smile, the same sorrow in his eyes. It hit me then. I wasn't talking to a living man at all. I was in contact with a ghost. Evan's spirit, it seemed, had become trapped between worlds, a lost soul reaching out through modern technology, desperate for closure or perhaps for justice. I couldn't ignore it. Determined to confront this impossible reality, I returned to the coffee shop, the site of our first meeting. I sat at our table, half expecting him to reappear. Minutes stretched into agonizing silence, until in the corner of my eye I saw him, a translucent figure seated as if he'd never left. He was unmistakably him, yet ethereal, a ghost in every sense. I gathered every ounce of courage and whispered, "Who are you?" His eyes met mine, and in that silent exchange, I understood his tragic story. Evan had been a victim of a long-forgotten injustice, his life cut short by circumstances that remained shrouded in mystery. Now, his spirit was left to wander, reaching out for the closure that had eluded him in life. I left the coffee shop that day forever changed. I couldn't shake the realization that sometimes the past doesn't rest quietly. It reaches out in the most unexpected ways. My encounter with Evan revealed that the digital world might just be a bridge between eras, a place where the living and the dead can collide. If you ever get a message that seems to echo from another time, or if a connection feels too surreal to be real, trust your instincts. Because sometimes, even a simple swipe on Tinder can invite you to confront the mysteries of a haunted past.
If you're still here, you've been marked. The only way to stay safe? Stick with us. Subscribe before it's too late. And if you have a horror story of your own, something real, something you can't explain, tell us in the comments or send us an email. We're always watching.